Hello, everyone. Today, during the New York Dance and Arts Innovation Quarantine Talks, we have a special guest composer who is writing both the classical music, but also songwriting. The Jimmy Kachulis from Boston, who originally would join us, and now from the Berklee College of Music, when he just finished the semester, he will share with us about the last year working with students virtually, and also about his upcoming projects. And we are very curious how he's combining those two different worlds with the songwriting, also with classical music. So first of all, Jimmy, congratulations for winning the prize for the horn solo for the Lament for the last year New Vision composition competitions that now will be voting soon, very soon, voting for the online voting for the public award, because the winning prize for those 4 pieces for horn, a trumpet, saxophone, and trombone, the audience will decide which one will be performed live at the Chopin and Friends Festival in November 2021 this year. Congratulations, and so good to have you. Very nice to see you.
Thank you. It's so nice to be here. I love the fact that the quarantine and the lockdown has not impeded us any more than it has already with live performances. But so many of the composers and performers are figuring out ways to stay active and using the technology. Like we're right now sitting 250 miles apart, conducting a live interview and conversation. And so one of the things that I think we're thinking about as musicians is seeing the challenge here, and rising to the challenge of, for instance, writing for smaller ensembles. So many of the things that so many of my winning competitions in the last year and a half have all been for solos. I think the music spirit is undeterred. We figure out a way to make things work.
Yes, I also want to mention, because Jimmy, you are originally from New York, right?
Yes.
From Brooklyn, right?
Yes.
Right. So do you often come back to New York also?
I did for a while because I had a lot of friends there. Not too much anymore. Since COVID, the whole city, and of course we had our own lockdowns here. But I love going back to New York. However, I found that New York it has changed quite a bit since I lived there. I was a school teacher many years ago, but then I was a freelance musician in the recording business and all kinds of things in New York. And in those years, I found that freelance musicians could, by living in the outer boroughs or out in New Jersey, you could make a modest income and live a reasonable, middle-class life out in Queens, or out in, a lot of musicians worked in Hackensack, or out in Jersey, in the Bronx. Yeah. I can't believe how expensive New York has gotten. And the disheartening thing is that a number of musicians are having such a rough time, freelance musicians particularly, having such a rough time in New York. If they don't have a teaching job, they could usually paste together a freelance thing. They might do, Handel's Messiah during the season. They might do some ballet performances, some Broadway show subbing. Broadway has been shut down for a year. That was always our catch-all.
Yes, that's right.
New York has really, the middle band, where most freelance musicians like me used to live and work, just has been getting wiped out. And I think COVID has just made it much more difficult, because I wanted to develop my career as a guitar player. So I would take these things off records and I would arrange them for 4 guitars. Guitar players love to play in 4 guitar ensembles because we never get hired to do that. We get hired to basically play a groove in a jingle or with a band. So that was my premise. I took a bunch of jazz tunes off records and I arranged them for 4 guitars. The idea being that they would see what a great guitar player I was and hire me to work in Broadway and in the studios, and it never happened. But they kept saying, "Boy, you're a great writer." And I kept saying to myself, I don't want to be a great writer. I want to be a great guitar player. Don't you get this? So after hearing this over and over again, I started to say, you know what?
I'm going to try.
Yeah, let me give it a shot, you know. And that's, again, that's the other thing in New York. I looked up the great jazz musicians and classical musicians and studio arrangers. They were giving classes, whether it was privately or through a nonprofit like Jazz Mobile used to give free jazz lessons. And Don Sebesky gave private classes, you know, for string writing, for horn writing, for rhythm section arranging. So I started studying that as an arranger. And an arranger in the popular music, it basically takes a song and arranges it for different instruments.
Right.
And I quickly realized there was no money in that because it's a work for hire. And so gradually, I started to get really interested in composition, which I had no training in. Because when I went to school, everything was severely serial music, atonal composition. That was the academic accepted style in the 70s. All these serial composers had gone into academia. So you either wrote severe 12-tone music or you didn't study composition in New York in those years. It was not nowadays where people are much more open to a wide diversity of styles. So I went into jazz and I started writing these simple little jazz tunes. And because of my background, you know, I'm from a Greek background. So I did a lot of the Greek work in New York, in those clubs, playing weddings. And these guys would play this incredible music on these instruments called the bouzouki, playing these scales and rhythms. I didn't know what was going on. You know, I can't even count where these guys are playing. These totally, like the rhythm that you're going to hear in the horn piece. The first time I heard that rhythm, I didn't know where the downbeat was. You know? And so I gradually discovered the different worlds of music. So my mission is basically take the structures, the amazing structures from Western European art music, and fill those bottles, as it were, with the wine of the world music that I know.
But Jimmy, about the horn piece, when did you compose the piece? Why did you use the horn? Do you play the horn? And when did you compose this piece, the Lament?
The original theme, again, was something that I wrote to be improvised on. I used to have a world music band. So I wrote this little short theme, and then we would improvise on it for 20 minutes. And so when I started getting back involved in composition, again, around 2019, rather than start from scratch, I went back and took a lot of my old themes.
Oh, I see.
The subsequent compositional chops or skills that I had studied, and say, okay, now I can add a contrasting middle, and that I can form that as a large A section. Now I can modulate somewhere else into a large B section. Then I go back to the A section, and so a little theme that may have been, you know, 12 or 16 measures long wound up growing into these longer pieces. And that was this is one of the instances of that. The original theme was written many years ago.
I see. So we are talking about the Lament. I'm going to share, people can see just the piece. Yes. This is the piece that we are talking about, the Lament. It's for horn solo.
Yeah. So one of the things that I think, because of the where I am personally in my life, I'm not somebody who's coming out of graduate school at 25 who has made a lot of contacts with people, performers and other composers and presenters. I'm coming at this very late in the game. So one of the things that I do is, I'm not sure if the word is absolute music, but it's a very Baroque kind of approach, not in the terms of the decorations, but in the terms of, most of the listeners will be familiar, I think, with the Bach solo violin music, for instance. The partita, the opening from the partita in E major is for solo violin. It's one of the classic solo violin pieces, but it was originally written for lute in G major. And here's two instruments that are widely diverse in their sound, their ability to sustain, et cetera, et cetera. It's the same piece. And yet Bach also used the same piece as a prelude to two different cantatas.
That's right.
Where he took a piece, so think about this, a piece that was originally for solo lute.
Recycling.
He recycled for solo violin, and then he recycled for full orchestra.
Yeah.
So that was my premise. And, due to the wonders of music notation, I use Sibelius. I would take a monophonic piece like this and just keep reorchestrating it. In fact, this is the fourth version of this piece that won an award. The first one was for solo flute.
I see.
In tribute to Theodore Antoniou, who was a Greek man who was a big champion of contemporary music in Boston, for a CD in Greece that just won a bunch of awards. So then I arranged it, again, reorchestrated for solo viola, and the Boston New Music Initiative performed it. And then they had a call for scores in memoriam for Morton Feldman, great 20th century composer.
Of course, amazing.
And so I, again, reorchestrated for clarinet. And those are the three versions that won the awards. And this is the fourth version. And I actually just, to expand this out again, once you understand the Baroque concept that the harmony can be implied by a monophonic instrument, if you have the harmonic underpinning in your ear, then fleshing it out. So all of those pieces that were originally for solo violin, I've already done them for all kinds of string and woodwind duos, and I just redid them. In fact, there's a workshop this weekend with a string quartet in Texas that's going to be doing the string quartet version of this piece.
Oh, wow.
If we get a chance, I'll play you a little bit of the string quartet version. And then you get the chance to use counterpoint, but I know what the harmony is because I have it in the back of my ears. It's implied in this monophonic version.
But Jimmy, if you have, that's a great idea. We're gonna, at the end of our conversation, we're gonna play this version for string quartet because that's very interesting that people can also compare, because we have on our YouTube channel also recording by Jacek Muzyk, who was doing the recording on the horn, but they can also compare. But I have a question, because actually I was going to ask about you about this piece about the rhetorics and the Baroque. You mentioned Baroque, but I was thinking about the rhetorics, which was very important for Bach, how he was repeating, how many times he was repeating, what he was repeating. It's like a speech, because I could feel a lot of gestures, a lot of kind of rhetorics that you can find in the Baroque music. So I'm interested if you study rhetorics, you like rhetorics, if you can say a few things about that.
Can you just clarify a little bit for me what you consider to be rhetorics?
Rhetorics, yes. Rhetorics is like a Matheson, right? For example, when you strong opening, when you have to have strong opening, then you have to have repetitions. Then after repetition, you have a theme, you have to develop this. You can have gestures. These gestures, for example, implies the sadness, like patopoia. Yes, like patopoia, when you go descending motifs. All of this Baroque music had this rhetorics. And it's like a good speech. Rhetorics means an interesting speech that you're all the time talking about with expression, and you have gestures for that. And you have those gestures. For example, beginning of the speech, 3 times repeat this motif, like a strong opening, right?
Yes.
So you like that. You also study that?
Yes. It's interesting that you mentioned that, because I hadn't thought about it consciously until I read a book. I'm trying to think about the book. I think it was the Stein book on music in the classical era, where he draws direct parallels between, introducing an idea, the exposing of an idea, and then presenting the arguments.
Presenting, exactly.
And that is really, of course, being somewhat familiar with the ancient Greek, this is one of the things that they had in the ancient days, where the arts were more integrated. We understood music as sort of not just a dramatic presentation, but also sort of an empirical delineation of an argument, as it were. Now, the interesting thing to me is that in Baroque era, there's a direct parallel between a Baroque aesthetic, where there was something called the Doctrine of the Affects, which music was supposed to elicit certain emotional responses. And in the Baroque era, the earlier 18th century, the focus was on one affect pretty much per section. And unless it was incredibly dramatic, you know, in some of the passions, where suddenly the affect will come in crashing, you know,
Suddenly, yeah.
Taking Jesus down from the cross, and suddenly the music takes this dramatic turn. By and large, each section in Baroque is supposed to be focused on the elicitation of one affect. And this is directly parallel in India, where they call them rasas, R-A-S-A. And each raga has a certain rasa that's supposed to be elicited by that raga, which is why they play these things for hours and hours, and you're supposed to be in that emotional framework. So in the Baroque era, what I noticed is, particularly in the da capo arias, in the B sections, they would go to a contrasting affect. This, of course, they don't do in India at all. But in the Baroque, that was the difference. Whereas in the later 18th century, you know, when you get the classical era, and, you know, then the sonata comes in, and you have those two affects fighting each other, basically. The initial theme, and then the second theme, which is supposed to have, to use the Baroque terminology, a contrasting affect. And the way they interact becomes much more of a sort of a debate. You know, when this theme comes in and then the other theme is answered, and sometimes the themes are reharmonized. And, you know, when you have a great composer, then they're superimposed and counterpoint with each other. And that starts to, brings out a different emotional kind of atmosphere. And I think that's one reason why Baroque music is almost has a sedative kind of effect on people. You know, they get into that affect. Whereas the music starting in the classical era, and then continuing, you know, if you think about Chopin, suddenly we get these dramatic shifts of emotional affect.
Yes.
Beethoven, you know, is probably the greatest example, where you'll be in one affect for 16 measures, and then suddenly it's like we're in this nightmare for the next 32 bars. And Chopin's...
Yes, but you mentioned Chopin. I want to ask you, because we have Chopin and France Festival. Idea always of the festival that I'm interested directing is that we start from Chopin as a grandfather, because Chopin as a Polish composer, right? So the composer who actually was very writing for piano, but he is a grandfather for a lot of also Polish composers, and even Lutosławski you can find the inspirations, even Szymanowski, but also the modern composers can find sometimes some inspiration. What do you think about the Chopin as a composer for the modern world, for the contemporary composers?
I think Chopin, for me, was the guiding light out of the mess of the 20th century. You know, I studied, again, very sophisticated jazz with some of the greatest jazz musicians. I studied with some of the greatest classical musicians. Louise Talma was basically the American Boulanger. And I saw that classical music got to a certain impasse. They completely sacrificed the audience. Musicologically speaking, they sacrificed meter, they sacrificed tonality, and along with those two things, they sacrificed the audience. There was virtually no audience. I went to all the contemporary concerts in New York for years, and I realized it was the same 300 people going to all those concerts. And I couldn't figure out what to do next. And I saw jazz doing the same thing. The jazz of the 60s and the 70s started to get more and more atonal, more and more chromatic. Meter was not a big thing anymore. And I didn't know what to do next. And once I discovered Chopin, because Chopin, you know, we think of Chopin, you know, the people like Chopin always being there. But you think about, you know, somebody came along, what would you want to do after Handel and Bach and Mozart and Haydn and Beethoven? What could you possibly do after these people did this? I think because Chopin came from Poland, he came from the East. These composers are from Western Europe. Chopin now brought in, number one, the rhythms from Poland, the mazurka, the polonaise. Yes, he used the waltz, but the waltz was not confined to Germany in those centuries. So Chopin showed me the way to take the folk dances and the folk tonality. Chopin is using some things. Yes, of course, he's using some of the vocabulary from the late 18th, early 19th century, but he's also doing certain melodic things that don't exist in Western Europe. You hear it particularly in some of the mazurkas, where he's bringing in some of those scales, some of those gestures. And so to me, Chopin provided the answer to go back to the roots of, in my case, the Greek tradition, and even beyond that, back to the Indian tradition, and yet keep it centered in the folk rhythms, the rhythms that the audience can feel on a kinesthetic level. And it's interesting because as I began to delve into Chopin, I studied, and I still study Chopin's music. I think he's just one of the incredibly great composers. His approach to form is not as regulated, is not as predictable. Mm-hmm. Chopin will do this, and then he'll do this, and then suddenly we get this 9-minute piece that does not follow a standard form. His approach to harmony. I mean, without Chopin, you don't have Wagner. He pioneered virtually every later 19th and early 20th century. The whole principle of thematic transformation, which you hear in the G minor ballade, that's the precursor of the leitmotif that Wagner did a generation later. And the other thing I love about Chopin, you know, his 3 big influences were Bach.
You have leitmotifs in your music, don't you?
Well,
Lament, there is leitmotif.
Yes, yes. You really, I'm glad you picked up on that. It's like characters being developed in a play.
Yes, yes.
You know? And the last thing, believe me, I could talk about Chopin all day. Mm-hmm. The last thing was he showed me how to reconcile seemingly opposing influences, because the big influence for Chopin were Bach, which is, you know, highly intellectual, contrapuntal approaches, compose the subject, compose the counter subject, do they work in invertible counterpoint, can you do it in stretto, can you do it, and then Mozart, you know, incredibly lyrical, pianistic based. And the last influence on Chopin, oddly enough, was Bellini, who was an opera. And so when I heard that, then I understood that those incredibly decorative right-hand motions that Chopin, he's copying the opera singer. And he did it on an instrument which is a quintessentially percussion instrument. I mean, the piano is hammers. It's 88 hammers hitting strings. And somehow he transformed this incredibly ornamental vocal tradition from Italian opera onto the piano. And reconciling those influences, it continues to be incredible influence for me. I just finished taking a month-long class with a former student on this incredibly ornamental clarinet music from northern Greece. Mm-hmm. I'll send you some of the links. It's one of the most complex ornamental music I've ever heard. But once we had to sing it, now I'm trying to figure out, I'm saying to myself, if Chopin could do that with Bellini, I can do that with Greek clarinet music.
But you know what was very interesting when I mentioned about figurations, because the figuration of Chopin has a huge range. So also, if you're going to think about our Western Bach, more even you have ornaments, little trills, mordents. Yes. They are very, very small intervals. But if you're going to think about these big ornaments of Chopin, even from the first nocturne of Chopin, you have huge range. You go over 3 octaves.
Right.
And it's very much in Asian music also, you can find those ornaments are always large.
Yes, yes. And that's, you see, so when we're inspired by a different genre, in this case, pianist being inspired by a vocalist or a clarinetist, we incorporate that subtlety of ornament.
Yes.
But then we have an advantage. You know, we have a much bigger range. That's you know, the poor singer is limited to maybe 1.5, 2 octaves. The piano, we got this gigantic thing. Now you can bring back the melody, as he often does, in the left hand, 3 octaves lower than it was. And there's all kinds of different things going on in the right hand. That's the advantage of writing. And so, you know, you listen to endless recordings of Greek and Turkish and Bulgarian folk music. They're all in A and D and C because those are the open strings.
Open strings, yeah.
and they don't modulate. That's not their thing. You know, for them to play something in B flat minor is virtually impossible. But we can do that. And that's another thing that Chopin did, you know. He was, I think, the first, aside from the Well-Tempered, where we know that Bach took things in simple keys and transposed them to difficult keys, because he had a pedagogical agenda as well. He wanted to show that you could play in all 12 keys, because the Well-Tempered temperament had arisen. But Chopin was, I think, the first composer of the modern era who would really sit down and write something in F sharp, and write something in G flat, and write something in C sharp. And now we have double sharps and double flats, and that's something that you wouldn't hear, I bet my life, in the traditional folk musicians from Poland who played the mazurkas and the polonaises, who, you know, kept to simple harmonies, simpler melodies. So I, you know, I again got a lot of hints from the way he did things. And for me, it's all about the vocal melody. So I tend to gravitate more towards styles that have a vocal basis, like the mazurkas that are vocally based, like the arias.
But don't you think that the Beatles, even Paul McCartney and John Lennon, they use a lot of melodic elements from Bach regarding how to create a melody? They had this knowledge, intuition, you know?
And one of the reasons, it turns out, is that Paul McCartney's father was a jazz musician, but he also played a lot of classical music around the house. So Paul has that, and you can hear his melodies are quite different than Lennon's. Lennon's are much more influenced by rock music, very much narrow pitch.
Intervals, pitch, yes, narrow pitch. And McCartney is always
jumping. All over the place. I mean, he has the vocal chops to do this. He's one of the great pop voices of all time. But it seems like he has this melodic gift. And my theory is that it's because of the music he heard as a young boy growing up, that those big leaps from classical music were just in his ears. And there's a songwriter in Brazil who has a very similar kind of background. Milton Nascimento is his name. And his parents also exposed him to jazz and classical music from a very young age. And his melodies are not typical Brazilian melodies. They have the infusion of the Brazilian atmosphere and rhythm, but they're very different than any other Brazilian songwriter. So to me, the difference between a song and a piece like this is things like the form is different. The vocabulary in a popular song is very narrow. You know, there are certain chords that we use, there are certain rhythms that we use, there are certain melodic structures that we use. And so when I write a piece like this, the vocabulary is just different. The pitch vocabulary is different, the rhythmic vocabulary is different. But I don't see these things as mutually exclusive. And I'll tell you where I learned that, Jacob. I sang a mass with a guy who wound up becoming very famous in the early music area, named Richard Taruskin. He just, this guy was a genius. He just wrote the entire Oxford history of Western music himself. All 14 volumes. He's just such a brilliant guy. And I sang a composite mass with him. A composite mass is where you take a movement on the same cantus firmus by different composers. And I sang this mass on the famous cantus La Marmée.
La Marmée.
Yeah, it's probably the most popular cantus firmus. This was many, many years ago. The musicology had decided that the La Marmée tune was a folk song from the 15th century. And it was set, you know, by all the famous composers through the 16th century.
One of the most important and the most famous.
Yeah. And so when I sang it, however, in the 1970s, they thought Dufay wrote it because he did some of the first art song settings. And so when we sang that on the original program, it says this melody is attributed to Dufay. Now, Dufay was by far the most sophisticated composer of the 15th century. I mean, he has isorhythmic motets based on the mathematical proportions of the cathedrals and incredibly complex music. And yet he has these songs that are incredibly diatonic, a very clear AABA phrase structure, very repetitive poetry happening over, and it's basically a strophic poetry. They sing 6 stanzas to exactly the same music. And later on, 20 years later, with additional musicology, they somehow determined that Dufay did not write this. It was, in fact, a folk song that all the great composers used. So that really, to me, that is incredibly significant, that the vocabulary and the syntax for very simple folk songs, for quote-unquote art songs, you have the chansons of the 15th century, the famous French chansons of the 15th century, and the vocabulary and syntax for the most sophisticated, complex music is the same vocabulary and syntax. It's just a question of the extent of the form. Those masses, oh God, the Dufay Mass on the La Marmée goes on for about 40 minutes. I get my initial idea almost exclusively vocally. I hear that motive, and then I develop it. And then if I'm writing for an instrument, then of course I have the advantage, as you hear in this. There's another thing in this piece that I think you'll find fascinating, that the horn is actually playing in 2-part counterpoint, or with themselves. There's actually an accompanying part and a melody part.
Yes, it's like super Bach.
Yes, just like Bach, where it's differentiated in register. And it's also usually differentiated in motivic content. So this motive that you hear in the accompaniment, which is from the original dance, da-da-dam, that's the accompaniment motive from the dance, that happens in one register. And then the melody, I tried to get it in the other register. With the horn, it's difficult because it's, they don't have a 3-octave register like the violin does. But then when it came back in invertible counterpoint, then the melody would be in the bottom.
Yes, they change positions.
It changes like that to give it variety.
I remember.
You see, it's and so I like that kind of challenge to write for a monophonic instrument, particularly a wind instrument. The strings have double and triple stops, but the wind instruments don't. You have to do that purely with register and timbre and motives. And that's the challenge.
You can do illusion of the polyphonic instrument.
Exactly.
Illusion,
Exactly.
Yeah. But Jimmy, the last question before we listen to this Lament on the string version also, but I want to ask you, how do you feel the quarantine time as a teaching online? How did it work? How were the students? Were they inspired? Were they depressed? So tell a few words about this teaching situation currently at your university, College of Berkeley.
Yeah, it's interesting because I'm also involved in a program called Berkeley Online. You can find this on the internet. It's a gigantic music school that we created.
I know.
And so that had to be asynchronous learning. And this starts, in 1999 when we started this. So I already had to solve that problem. How to teach people when the teacher was not in the room. So I'm very used to thinking in those terms.
Machine learning.
There are certain disadvantages to teaching remotely. And I think particularly from what I understand, we just had a meeting about it, for performing ensembles. The software is not quite to the point that you can synchronize an ensemble when people are in different locales.
And acoustic is different, surrounding is different. Acoustics, you can hear the
very
space
different.
Is different.
And I understand from the private lesson teachers, even that's a challenge because the fidelity is not quite there. You're hearing out of these little tiny speakers. So when you're trying to address timbre and articulation, this is a real challenge for them. But I teach mostly writing classes and survey classes. So for me, there are some significant advantages. If I'm demonstrating in a songwriting class, I'm demonstrating to use our terminology, the affect of the Mixolydian mode. It has a completely different emotional atmosphere than major. Yeah. If a student doesn't get it in those 45 minutes, they don't get it. If I teach remotely, and that 2-hour lecture is recorded, which it is, they can go back and listen to that thing for 10 hours. And that's one of the primary advantages. To me, there's two. It's time and space. They're no longer confined to the 2 hours in my classroom. They can listen to that thing endlessly. So what I tend to do is a little bit less interactive remotely, which is a little bit of a drag. I think they feel a little bit less involved, but the advantage is they can listen to me talk those 2 hours. They can play for 100 times if they feel like, until they get it.
Thank you very much for having time with us during this New York Dance and Arts Innovation Quarantine Talks. Thank you again, and congratulations for winning the prize with the Lament that we just discussed. And I suggest that at the end of our conversation, we'll listen this string quartet version of the same piece, and you can compare the differences, because as you know, we will have a voting now, public voting from 4 winning pieces for the saxophone, trumpet, trombone, and the horn, and the people can vote till 1st of September, and those pieces which will have the most votes will be performed live on top of this virtual performance. So Jimmy, congratulations, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Jacob. It was really a pleasure to talk to you, and if there's one thing I can leave you with is God bless you for staying the course and still promoting new music during this time of crisis for us. I think the people need it more than ever. So
it's my pleasure, and thank you very much. It was a really great time, and so now we are going to join to listen this string quartet. Have a great day, Jimmy.
Okay.
Thank you. All the best for your future career.